Welcome to the Change the Balance podcast and YouTube channel, where we are opening up our hearts, mind, and souls to explore the challenges, barriers, and opportunities available to leaders who are creating safe and inclusive spaces. With Sabrina, Shadie, Ethics and Equity Specialist, and Charlotte Hopkins, Learning and Development Expert, together, along with our guest experts, we will be sharing our own personal journeys, inspirational stories, and top tips on how we are becoming allies that tackle stigma, prejudice, and discrimination head on. Welcome to the Change the Balance podcast and YouTube channel, where we are opening up our hearts, mind, and souls to explore the challenges, barriers, and opportunities available to leaders who are creating safe and inclusive spaces. With Sabrina, Shadie, Ethics and Equity Specialist, and Charlotte Hopkins, Learning and Development Expert, together, along with our guest experts, we will be sharing our own personal journeys, inspirational stories, and top tips on how we are becoming allies that tackle stigma, prejudice, and discrimination head on. Welcome back. We are on episode 5, and woof, do we have a spicy one for you this week? So welcome to the Change the Balance podcast and YouTube channel. As I said, it's YouTube 5. No, it's episode 5. So if you haven't already clicked, don't forget to subscribe, because this one in particular, you're going to want to re-listen to again. So this week, we're going to be talking about allyship, and it really leads nicely onto last week's leads on nicely, goodness me, get my teeth in, from episode 4, where we talked last week around privilege. And allyship is something that I hadn't even really heard of until a few years ago. The good news is I was doing some allyship, but nowhere near enough allyship, which we'll be talking through today. But it's something that is, I feel, often misunderstood. So yeah, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So my name's Charlotte, and I am a learner development, that word expert. We've talked about it before. And I will pass you over to my absolute wonderful friend, Sabrina.
Hi, yeah, I'm Sabrina Shadie, and I'm an equality, diversity, inclusion specialist. I've avoided the word specialist.
We've got such a word with that term expert, haven't we?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, allyship is one of those things. I really probably came across the word first, in school when you're learning about the Second World War, when they talk about the Allies. We all got together, all of these allies across Europe to work in collaboration. That was the kind of when I first heard the word. So when the word came back into kind of a resurgence in terms of equality, diversity, and inclusion spaces, I was like, oh yeah, I know that word. That word is a word of camaraderie and support and collective resource. And I was like, that makes sense to me, because I connected it with that history lesson thing from school.
I've never connected it until you've just said.
Right, okay.
That's literally like blown my mind. I'd never really, linked those two together.
Yeah, so because I don't think we really use the word in other elements of society, and generally. So when I first was hearing that word again, I was like, allies, like allies in that war, where we were struggling and we had to work collaboratively to attain a shared goal.
Yes, yeah.
Feels very familiar, right? So for me, the term allyship felt quite, I know what that means. I know what that looks like. It looks like everybody having this shared goal. And although we have lots of differences and lots of, different elements to how we do what we're doing, we're all trying to attain that same thing and bring everybody with us. It's not good enough that I attain it if I'm not bringing all of the other allies with me, all of the other team members with me.
Can I stop you there? I'm really curious about this. Has like got my mind buzzing now. I'm wondering as well. So last week we talked about privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering whether in history, I make no bones about it. My husband did a history degree, and I'm not particularly interested in history, never particularly have been interested in history, unless it's relatable. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering whether, so within the EDI space, I'm wondering whether it resonates because it feels like a war, that from a discrimination and prejudice perspective, feels like a battle rather than a war. I, from a privilege standpoint, have openly never needed to, in a, quote unquote, battle in that sense. So I'm wondering whether that allyship term hadn't connected the dots for me because of my privilege. I don't know.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I like history anyway. Like just as a human being, I enjoy stuff around history, because I feel understanding where we came from to understand where we are now, and particularly around changing the narratives and moving away from certain unhealthy behaviors and stuff is really, really key. So as a social scientist brain, you have to understand that where we've come from to trying to generate a different outcome where we're trying to go. And in addition to that, I think in terms of equality, diversity, inclusion, understanding the history is really key.
But that's and that's really interesting, because again, I think this is where, and we're probably going further back, I guess, to episode 4 a little bit, but I will promise I'll bring it back into allyship in a moment. But there's something there about my not relating to that, because I know my history. I know, fundamentally, loosely where I come from. So that inherent privilege of knowing my family tree, if you like, it's just, I've never needed to think about it. I've never needed to second guess it.
And in addition, you never need to think about it in a sense that somebody's going to question you or deny you what your history is. So I can say, I know exactly what my history is. I'm really, really privileged. I know my family history for quite a few generations. And being somebody who's from Commonwealth immigrant family, that's not particularly usual. In a lot of spaces, people don't always know more than sort of 2 or 3 generations back, but I do. I've still been told that that's not correct by people who have never met me before. Because people, their privilege tells them that doesn't sit with their understanding of the world. So they're going to reject it and tell me that I don't, that what I'm saying is completely wrong, regardless of the fact that I have evidence to prove that it is correct. And I think that kind of privilege challenge, when we challenge that and become allies, we're recognizing that actually you don't need to be like, I need to justify my existence here. I need to say, no, actually my family are from the Commonwealth. We were British citizens before we stepped foot on this island. All of my family travelled to the UK on British passports, because people from around the Commonwealth were considered British and British citizens, back all those generations ago. People in the UK don't necessarily understand that history. So when you're saying, no, we're not immigrants, I am British, not just because I was born here, but because my family have been for generations, and you'll get questioned and told that's not true. You've never had, like, being in a position where no one's questioning your history, no one's questioning your background or your right to be here. That is a privilege, and as an ally you get to put a stop when you see those things being questioned of people, or when you see those conversations taking place. And that's really where the allyship part comes in. You don't need to know my history, you don't need to see my family tree. You just need to know that actually when you step in and block those negative conversations, or provide that allyship and stand side by side with somebody, that changes their experience.
And I think that's where I really get excited about allyship and what it can achieve, and I think allyship is so important to creating equity. And it's a fine balance, and as we've talked lots, it's finding that balance between coming in and saving the day and being the savior of, and that can come back from, I remember when I was in my 20s stepping in and intervening to on behalf of a guy who was homeless, and he was getting quite a bit of stick from a drunk person, and I stepped in and he was like, fuck off bitch, it's nothing to do with you. And I was like, oh, and that was my first real understanding of who the hell are you to impose yourself. So finding that balance is really tricky, I think, and for some people it will be far harder than others. There'll be people who absolutely won't understand the term allyship at all, and then there'll be those of us who are desperate to eradicate that discrimination or that disadvantage or that prejudice and all these kind of things. But don't necessarily know when to hold back and when we're disempowering, not empowering. And that's a real balance, which is what makes this episode so important, and one that will be continued throughout all of the other episodes.
It's an ongoing theme, and it'll develop and change for individuals as they, you know, their skill set and their confidence and their whatever, as that develops as well. So for me, I think starting the conversation around allyship is like, oh, there's no job description, right? So there's no clear guidance on what you're supposed to do. And my answer would always be, consider how you would advocate for that person. You don't want to take away their autonomy. You don't want to take away their voice. How do you advocate for them in a way that enables them to feel empowered, to voice their opinion, and to feel safe while doing it?
Yeah.
So often it's about holding that space. It's about, you know, where someone's getting spoken over, maybe you taking the power and stopping the conversation, to go, actually, I think this person was trying to say something, and just kind of being that almost mediator in a space. I've worked in advocacy, I've worked in youth offending, so I've sat in those kind of panels where lots of professionals are talking at a young person, and I've had to go, actually, can we just give them 5 minutes to just process what you're saying and make sure they understand before we go any further, you know? And there's ways of doing that the other way and going, actually, this person's got something to say. This is about them. And it's not a space for me to speak. It's a space for them to speak, but I'm going to make sure that you listen. And I think where we're empowered as individuals, we can easily ally for those who maybe aren't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, just at its very core, it is about creating safe spaces. It is about creating that platform where people can engage in a conversation should they want to. That's the bit that is interesting for me, is that how do we learn to step back? So how do I learn, as somebody who is quite forthright, very opinionated, but also very reflective? But I know that part of the challenge for me has been to step back and go, this is not my place. It's not my place to get involved. It's not my place to be the power and the driving force. That sometimes you do need to step back and know when to step back. And I guess that challenge then as an ally is knowing when to step forward and when to step back. And that's the complicated bit, I think, because we overthink it. I believe. I think we overthink it and we over emotionalize, not sure emotionalize,
and personalize.
Personalize.
It's very much about the me part of it. And when we're trying to be allies, we're actually trying to take the me part out. So I would say we start with asking the person. So an example would be, if you've got somebody who has a disability in a space, don't speak to their carer over their head. You know, unless you know that they maybe can't hear you, or they wouldn't be able to. If you know that they wouldn't be able to respond, that's fair enough. But in general, speak to the individual themselves, as you know, as in whatever way you can, and get
not in a patronizing way.
Not
Hi, Sabrina, what do you think?
Just speak to that individual and ask them the question. You know, there was a lady waiting outside a toilet door in one of the train stations when I was traveling up to London, and I went to the loo and I came back, she's still waiting outside the and she's, you know, and I turned around and I said, you're still waiting, you've not been in and come out? And she went, no, I'm still waiting. And I went, do you mind if I just check if somebody's actually in there? And there wasn't. Somebody had accidentally knocked the thing, so it looked like it was locked when it wasn't. So I just opened the door and said, oh yeah, no, there's no one in there, bless. And she'd been waiting for goodness knows how long, being very polite in a very British queuing up kind of way. But I just asked her, is it okay if I do that thing? And it made her like, how long would she have been sat there otherwise? Because nobody else had bothered to engage and check. You know, and it's really simple to just give the person a bit of support, but B, within the, you know, providing them still the autonomy to make a decision and be in control of how much you help them. Generally, you know, they'll give you the direct, this is what I need. Because we know, as individuals, we know how much support we do or don't need. And we can be quite open about that if we're made to feel safe in that conversation and in that support. So that would be my first thing, is start with asking the individual. The second thing is, when you talk about human rights, like that's the base level of everything we talk about in EDI. are these people, whoever these people are, whichever package of people we're looking at supporting, are the people involved, are their human rights being met? Do they have all of the stuff off the Maslow hierarchy? And if not, how can we try and give them that access to those rights? Am I doing everything I can to make sure those people's rights, that I'm recognizing what their rights are around having a voice, around access to services and support? So those two areas are really the two things that I think would be at forefront of everybody's mind when you're trying to be an ally.
And I think that human aspect of it is really important, and I think we overly worry as human beings. I think, generally speaking, I believe most people are wanting to be compassionate, sensitive, appropriate. They, of course, we're always going to have certain people that aren't, but generally speaking, I think human beings want to be connective and social and belong and supportive, and lots of people who will do good deeds for other people do it because they're just decent human beings and they want to help people.
And I think that way.
And
we programmed to be community based.
And I think there's that worry when we start to overlap EDI, when we start to overlap allyship, when we start to talk about privilege, when we start to talk about messing it up. Like, what happens if I say something wrong? Hey, but what happens if you say something right? So I think that human aspect to it is really important, and that human first is, for me, the biggest message to take as an ally is, okay, as a human being, what is it that this human being needs?
100%. And I think the overthinking is natural. Everyone's so scared of getting it wrong, but actually getting it wrong isn't the worst thing you can do. Doing nothing is the worst thing you can do. We don't expect anybody in any scenario to get everything right every time. Like, we do not expect 100% success rate anywhere. In reality, like, we just don't. But in EDI, somehow, like, particularly talking about leadership, no one wants to do anything because everyone's so scared of getting it wrong. But to me, I look at it like toddlers learning to walk. They will fall on their butt numerous times before they get those first sort of few steps really pinned, and that's okay. The learning comes from the mistake. If you get everything right every opportunity throughout your entire life, you've learned very little.
And sometimes you fall. And sometimes you fall and bruise. Sometimes you fall and it hurts, but you then make sure that you don't hit that corner of the table again, because that corner hurt.
So in terms of allyship, using that learning to help others, like going, I messed this up, but I can help you not mess this up because you can learn from my mistake. That's what allyship is. That's the kind of.
I have a really good example of that, actually. A couple of months ago now, so somebody had reached out via Instagram to ask me their opinion of a service that I've been working with, and I immediately got overexcited, which I do, in case you hadn't noticed. I'm quite an excitable character, and I got overexcited because I really, really love the work that this person does, and left a 4-minute voice note praising, saying, oh, you'll love the experience, you need to go, and this is my top tips, and this is what my advice was, all within 3 minutes. What I hadn't looked at was, within about 10 seconds of the voice recording, this person had done a written note that says, I'm really sorry, I can't hear this, I'm deaf. So there was two things that struck me. One, oh my goodness, what a Wally, was the first one. Do people still say Wally? I said Wally.
You say Wally.
I said Wally. But two, how that person apologized to me. So there was two things there from an ally perspective. One, I jumped in and automatically assumed that it was okay to voice note. Clearly, I won't do that again. And two, I found it really interesting that person felt the need to apologize. Now, there's lots of kind of psychology around why people apologize first, and that may have been the surface level of it, and that's as deep as it went. But for me, there was, as an ally, this sense of guilt, shame to a certain extent, certainly embarrassment, that this person had apologized to me for my, what I see as my mistakes. And people, you know, I've had lots of conversations with people about it as I'm sharing it. They're like, oh, you weren't to know. No, I wasn't to know. But again, going back to that privilege, my privilege just assumed that that person would have it. And I've voice noted other people before and never had that issue. However, if we want genuine inclusion, surely all I need to say is, would you like me to voice note or can I voice note or is that?
And the thing is, even the fact you didn't ask first, you know now that the person's told you, you know that, and you will do it differently. You and I both love a voice note. It's much quicker than trying to type what's going on in our brains, just
talkers
blubble it all over a message for about half an hour. So I think reaching out to that person and asking them, really key. Like, how would you like me to communicate with you? And then we're all susceptible to being called out for our non-inclusive actions. I've done it. I've been told, oh, you know, for visually impaired people, my content, I wasn't putting alt text, I wasn't putting image descriptions. And yeah, it does feel like a bit of a kick. You're like, I never meant to exclude anyone. That was not my intention. But all of those negative emotions, we kind of need to leave them away, like move them away and step away from them, because they don't help us move where we want to go. So going, oh, that's a bit awkward, I'm a bit disappointed in myself, but that's more motivation to do something better. That's the direction I would kind of take with it, and been able to share that journey as a learning point for other people, to go, on my journey as an ally, this thing happened, and I would suggest this kind of improved practice for other EDI allies in future. You know, ask the person how they want to communicate, or and the thing is, because it's social norms, you know, you're not doing anything wrong. It's it's something you could do better.
And I think that's the thing for allyship for me, more than anything. My journey has been a bit of a roller coaster, I would say, whereas I thought I was doing quite a lot, and then I realized I wasn't, and then the more I've dug into, there's been many a times where I've contacted Sabrina and gone, I'm in this rabbit hole. No, I'm in this rabbit hole now. And the more I've researched, the more I've learned, the more I've reflected, the more questions I have. So it's been a really interesting journey for me as an ally, and I stand quite proud to say that I'm not perfect and I'm doing what I can, and I know I still have a lot to go, a long way to go, but we're moving in the right direction. And there's this kind of really common phrase of falling forward, and I feel like I'm falling forward all the time. I'm tripping up, there's hurdles, there's rocks, there's, you know, mountain climbing, but I feel like we're making that
it's
progress.
Still forward progress though.
It's forward progress.
Sometimes it's a tumble with no control whatsoever, but it's forward progress. And the thing is, you know, our issue with the word expert, we will never, none of us will ever have 100% of the knowledge, because there's so many intersectional elements of the experience of just being a human being, that we can't ever know all of that. We can know from our perspective. I provide a lot of guidance. I provide a lot of one-to-one support for people who, particularly people with disabilities in the workplace, particularly people who have intersectional challenges around employment and stuff. And we have these conversations, and they message me going, oh, this thing happened at work. How do I go forward with this? And, you know, I have connections with Unison reps and stuff like that to give advice and support and make sure, because I'm not legally trained. Like, I am not a lawyer. I'm not any of that stuff. Okay. But to me, the starting point is always going, okay, your rights, in terms of legal and human, are here. Best practice in terms of equality, diversity, and inclusion, and not just the compliance of what the law says, but best practice in terms of what's good for you as a human being in your circumstance, is somewhere here. And usually we have to find somewhere in the middle that supports the person, while the organisation is still willing to give that much. You know, what is a reasonable adjustment? Where's the word reasonable? How do you identify that, and so on? So there's no black and white answers. There's no clear cut. It's here. It's different for everybody. And in that journey, we have to recognize, I can't always get it right. I can't always be the expert. I will always be learning. When you recognize allyship from that space,
it's a whole different.
You don't mind getting it wrong as much. You don't feel like you will need to go and hide under a rock. every time something doesn't go 100%, because it's part of the journey.
And that's what I love about the Change the Balance community that is growing and growing and growing, is the sense of connection, the sense of safety, that sense of, I think I've messed up, what do I do? So having that kind of space to be able to personally reflect, professionally develop, and look at how we can grow, not only, you know, within the workplace. And I think, you know, the conference that we've got in September, we'll put links in the show notes. We'll put them below. But that conference is purposefully built to bring leaders together to have these conversations, to not only learn from incredible guest speakers, but also just to hear those lived experiences, to be able to know that somebody here and somebody here might look on the face of it very similar, but have very different experiences. And for me, the more,
and vice versa as well, people who might look completely different and come from completely different backgrounds have a really similar value set and a really similar you know, direction in what they're trying to achieve.
Absolutely. And I think that's for me, the more we talk about people's lived experiences and share those stories, the more we start to create more of a kaleidoscope effect in our brain, so that it doesn't become very color blocked. It's very speckled and changes and fluid and flexible. And, you know, it's really quite a creative space that the world is. And I think for me, bringing those lived experience stories together helps build that kaleidoscope together, because it's really easy for me to sit and listen to my friends. Now, if my friends are all white, economically active, you know, drive nice cars or have quite good jobs or all these kind of things, then my view is very singular. It's very color blocked. As you start to listen to other stories and you start to hear the similarities and you start to resonate and you start to see the representation, not only within people that don't look like you, but as well within the differences between people that do look like you, that's when we start to really open our mind. And I think the psychology will back that up, that, you know, if we talk about growth mindset, for example, the more we're exposed to information, the more we're able to gather what feels right and what feels connected. And I, again, fundamentally think people are just not opening their eyes enough to be really solid, good quality allies. And that's the beauty of lived experiences and really, truly listening to other people's stories.
Yeah, and things of allyship, it has to be a value set that you actually live to. It can't be something that you do when you go to work. Yeah. So a lot of sessions that we might do with people is like, what's your comfort zone? How many people in your close circle, you know, people who you could knock on their front door at 10 o'clock at night and they wouldn't ask you a question, they'd just open the door and you'd go in.
Yeah.
They wouldn't go, what are you doing on my doorstep? You would just walk into their house, or you'd be invited to their children's wedding, or those kind of people who are actually part of your community, your tribe. How many of them were born in a different country, have a different skin color, a different religion, speak a different language at home? You know, these kinds of questions, if you can answer them and go, actually, a good percentage, not one or two individuals, but actually a fair percentage of the people around me don't look like me, don't pray like me, don't speak like me, you're in a really, really good place in terms of allyship, because you probably have really good understanding of different experiences. If everybody around you, you know, 90+% of people around you look and behave exactly like you, what are you basing your allyship on? Because you know, how used to opening doors for other people are you? And are the other people you open the doors for also looking like you, behaving like you, praying like you know? And that's the understanding. The more of a diverse experience you have in your life, the more open you are to enabling that for other people.
Absolutely. And, you know, our Change the Balance Carnival is absolutely that celebration of diversity, and whether that's, you know, food recipes through to EDI law and how that applies to you in your workplace. That
recommendations.
That mix of culture and that mix of understanding is just really, really lovely, and that kind of celebration as well. Yeah, it's I think allyship is a really important thread of what Change the Balance has been built on, and that real need that, you know, we naturally talk a lot about white privilege because that's kind of what I can completely and utterly relate to, but it isn't just about that. It's about gender privilege, it's about, you know, religious privilege, it's about economic privilege. So there's all of these things that as allies we need to really challenge. And you know, we're episode 5 of our first podcast series, and I just think we've, you know, hopefully the listeners get a really good sense of what our values are and how we've come together to really talk about those shares and differences. And I'm sure at some point, we haven't quite got there yet, but those, you know, arguments that we're bound to have, but fundamentally going back to that,
growth-based arguments,
debates, passionate discussions, but fundamentally the value sets always come back to the same. So, you know, it's okay to argue and it's okay to disagree as an ally. However, that when you come back to that value set, it's exactly as you're saying, that's kind of fundamental and key to creating relationships and good dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, you can't agree all the time, because that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. Where we have the diversity, there's going to be, you know, things that don't sit comfortably together, or do you have to figure out how they sit together, and that difference of opinion, that stretching and growing and development of accommodating people who are different to you, is a really important part of allyship and a part of what we're trying to create in terms of Change the Balance.
Yeah, absolutely. So this week so far, we've talked lots about allyship, and last week we talked about privilege. If there's anything that our listeners are particularly interested in us talking about, we would love to hear from you. So you can get in contact with the Change Balance team via the YouTube links, but also you can get in contact with us via the website as well. So if there's anything in particular that you think, oh, I'd love to hear them debating that, or if you want to come on and be, you know, one of our guest speakers within the Change the Balance podcast, we would love to hear from you. If you're interested in sharing your story, or whether that's your journey to becoming a better ally, or whether that's your experiences of shitty discrimination and prejudice and just terrible treatment from others, we're welcome to talk about it all, because as we say, it's really, really important. So please feel free to get in touch whichever way you want to. But for now, thank you for joining us, and we will look forward to you joining us for episode 6.